I grew up in totally different environment that you may be accustomed to. I grew up in the former Soviet Union. That kind of sets the tone, right? You see that innocent boy on the left? I had my stages of rebellion. First in elementary school, because there's a girl I liked, and I got embarrassed about not coming to school on Sabbaths and going to church. And so I was different. So I compromised for a couple of years, and my grades went down, 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 down. And then when I was in grade 7, she kissed somebody else, and I realized it was not worth it. And I went back to church, and my grades went up. My second stage of rebellion was during military service, usually Seventh-day Adventist work in secondary roles, drivers, construction, kitchen, somewhere else. I wanted to learn to fight. So I went to sergeant school. It's a whole another story, but we're not talking about that. I grew up in a church that was very close-knit, and yet that church was operating that underground mentality and lacked trust and was very, very legalistic. Loving until it stopped being loving, until you do something wrong. If you walk today into any church in that part of former Soviet Union, the first thing you will see in the church is the 10 Commandments. That is the standard by which God judges you. And that is a serious business. The church is still stuck in that 1870s mindset. That's how our Adventist pioneers used to preach until after 1888 message replacing the law with Christ as our Redeemer. Now, why am I telling you this, friends? Because when you grow up in a certain environment, reading certain Bible translations, you are confused. Just like we start counting, I don't know you do counting in Hebrew from right to left here. You get my drift here. This is Russian to you. I don't know any Slavic-speaking people in the house, no? There are quite few in Florida. Nobody came for this meeting. They didn't know that a Slavic speaker would be here, I guess. It says, «Если сердце наше осуждает нас, то кольми паче Бог». To translate verbatim, that's what it means. If our hearts condemn us, how much more does God? Imagine growing up in that mindset. If you feel guilty, God is judging you 1,000 times more. That was the mindset because of the translations that were used in Russian language. Imagine my surprise coming to this side of the world, learning English, and reading that that's not what it says. It says if our hearts condemn us, God is greater than our heart. We're not judged by our heart. We have God who is greater than our condemnation, our guilt, and our broken heart. I left the old country, Ukraine, in 1992, 33 years ago. These are my mom and dad, and with what's happening in the world right now, I want you to understand, Ukraine is also a very dynamic, multi-tribal country. People in Western Ukraine, my mom, Polish kind of, they look different than people from Southern Ukraine, okay? And ethnically and DNA, there's a different dynamics there. But coming to Canada, I experienced major culture shock. You could imagine. I was actually the first student from former Soviet Union coming to Canada. Nobody's seen commies before. They didn't know how to deal with Ruski coming. In fact, I'm Ukrainian, but I've been called Russian for 30 years until the invasion started a few years back, okay? But learning that, I had to learn different meanings of words. And one of those words that I had to really grapple and figure out what does it really mean is the word grace. By the way, this is the picture from Ellen White's home church in Portland, Maine, which is a restaurant right now. Just tells you about the state of Methodist Church. See, we say grace at the table, right? But then we're told that we're saved by grace. Figure that. How's the prayer that you say at the table saves you? What is this grace business? Do we understand what grace means? Now, those who are into deep theology, you know that was a big debate in 1888 Minneapolis, right? This whole business of grace. What does grace mean? The younger generation was talking about faith and grace. The older generation were talking about works and law. And the key verse that was in debate at that session was Galatians 2:21. If righteousness comes through law, then Christ died in vain. The focus was on grace, and we could talk for a few sessions about the whole 1888 message. That would be really interesting and fascinating, but this is not where I'm going. What does it mean to be under grace? If you talk to an average evangelical Christian, when they say, I'm under grace, you know what they mean? I'm under mercy. They confuse grace and mercy. If you literally sit down, one of the evangelical preachers, and I spoke to many of them and asked them to explain to you what they mean by grace, you would realize they're talking about mercy. Now, is there a difference between grace and mercy? You bet you, huge difference. Now, I'm on my 4th church plant. 2 are only in Windsor, 2 were in London. We stayed in London for 11 years, raised 2 churches, opened a school that is successful in operation for 17 years already. And as we're planting this new church, it's a Kenya Rwanda church, people who came from East Kivu, Goma region in Congo, refugees, whole another long story. I preach with translator to them. And I've learned that their word for grace is Ubuntu. Now, to me, that was even more confusing because one of my mentees a few years ago was a South African fellow who lived in both countries, Zimbabwe and South Africa, and he told me what Ubuntu means. Now, some of you who are into computer probably familiar with running platform in Linux, right? Ubuntu. But the African message of Ubuntu is a bit different. It means I am because we are. It's that message of oneness, message of unity, message of striving together. And it's a beautiful word, but what does it have to do with grace? In fact, people from Africa say that Ubuntu is an African message to the world, but what does it have to do with grace? If we're saved by grace and grace is Ubuntu, what does it mean? We have to save each other? We have to help each other to be saved? How does it work, this Ubuntu business? We are one. Now, I want you to be thinking. There's a legend about Martin Luther throwing inkwell at the devil. Now, all it is a legend. Yes, he wrote a lot, and his writings really dispelled the deceptions of Satan. But if you were to travel there to Wittenberg and see his writing room, the inkwell was not something little on the table. It was that big stamp that they would fill with ink to write. So there was no way he was throwing it across the room. But here's what I mean by this. As I start studying deeper, I realized Martin Luther caused a little confusion on this subject of grace. When he was translating Bible into German, he ran across that Greek word hilasterion, and he translated this as Gnadenstuhl. Now, any German-speaking folks in the house? No? That's all right. We'll unpack it a bit more. Why is it confusing? Because hilasterion is not a Gnadenstuhl, it's a mercy seat. Do you see the difference between mercy seat and a grace stool? There's a difference between that. But somehow Martin Luther translated that as grace stool. Now, hilasterion is a kaphoret. It's that cover over the Ark of the Covenant that covers the law, and it's called Bema, the mercy seat. It represents the throne of God. But see, Martin Luther, when he was doing his translation, he ran into problem. He knew that there's a Greek word for grace and Greek word for mercy, and yet he chose to substitute these words. Now, I'm skipping because we could get distracted by deep theology. The reason, simply because German word for mercy is a complicated one. Don't even ask me to pronounce that, okay? You could try. There's much nicer word, gnädig, in German. And so he chose that word instead of that complicated long word for mercy. Now, my wife is Latin. and she's been teaching me Spanish over these years. But if I go to Google and say God's grace or God's mercy, notice what Google tells me. Both are what? Gracia. The same. Do you see the confusion? The world is confused, thinking grace is mercy and there is no difference between them. Now, my wife told me that there's a different Spanish word for mercy. It's misericordia. But it sounds bad to my ear, just like that German word. It sounds like my misery is being recorded. Okay? And so you understand why sometimes when we're translating, we're choosing words that just soften the blow. And so in German, there's this word gnädig, which is a beautiful word. Merciful, kind, compassionate, graceful. And so Martin Luther chose this word and caused the confusion for the next 500 years where Christians around the world thinking that grace is mercy. And I have a problem with that because I think we're missing something important as fathers, as believers in our life. Now, we all know what mercy is, right? Not getting what we deserved, not being punished. Do you remember that sinner beating his chest and saying what? God, have mercy on me, be merciful to me. We know what mercy is. Not getting the punishment we deserve. But here's a definition of grace that I love very much. I use it pretty much at every funeral. It's recorded in letter of Paul to Titus. For the grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men doing what? Teaching us. Do you understand? Grace is something that teaches us how to live godly, soberly, righteously. Friends, this would be another theological journey. Torah is grace. Why? Because Torah is teaching. You understand that? The 5 books of Moses was God's grace to the people because he was teaching them how to live right. Grace is empowering us to live right. Grace is giving us tools how to live right, and that's a great teaching. In fact, we as parents, as men, should help our kids, should help the next generation to know how to live right, and by that would be given grace in their lives. But there is more to it, because I'm still working from the Western definition of grace. It makes sense. Apostle Paul writes, by grace you are saved. And Paul would write that the doctrine that you've learned has saved you. In the same letter to Romans, Paul is talking how the teaching has a salvific power to it. But we're still missing something very much. Because see, this saved by grace through faith, been faithfully preached by the first 2-3 century church fathers using Greek language and talking about that charis and pistis. There was no problem until it got translated into Latin. Some of you may have heard the name of Augustine, right? Saint Augustine. He's also called the Doctor of Grace. And he introduced even more problem. He envisioned that grace is a tool to be used, and that's the tool that God is using for our salvation. So far, so good? But you know, Western mind wants to dissect everything and put on a shelf and make a tool out of it. Guys, you would understand this. You walk in your garage and you have a special wall where all your tools are labeled, right? And you have your metrics and imperial and everything there. That's what Augustine did to grace. He says basically there's all kind of graces. Choose which one you need for the situation. Prevenient grace, saving grace, irresistible, temporary, elective, covenant, all kind of graces. This is not a complete list. According to Augustine, there's 16 types of grace. What does it mean to be saved by grace? When our kids come to us seeking grace, do we know what to give them? Do we know what grace is? Now, if you go into deep study, you'd realize there's both mercy and grace. But today, I'm about to share with you something I discovered recently, and I wish I would have known this all my life. A year ago, by the way, do not miss your Sabbath school. Something good that came out from the pandemic, we got more serious about our Sabbath school in our church. It started being used as a tool of spiritual revival. A year ago, the first quarter, we're studying Book of Psalms. And a particular week, we're looking at this Psalm 51. You all know it, right?
Yes.
And I found it confusing that many translations have different renderings of mercy in the same verse, right? Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy enduring mercy, according to the multitude of thy tender mercies. If you look at different translations, they're all trying to render differently, but the bottom line is this. There are three Hebrew terms used there that are translated as mercy, but the same terms could be also translated as grace. Now, I don't know if you're confused already, because I'm trying to argue that grace is not mercy, and yet when you dive into Hebrew, somehow they use them interchangeably, grace and mercy. But let's make it simple, because those three terms are deeply relational. Let's look first at that hesed. Many of you probably heard the term hesed, right? Anyone who dealt with theology knows hesed. Hesed is the kind of love that runs after you. As a parent, have you ever run after your kid or grandchild? Especially if they're running into trouble. That's the grace that runs after you. Grace that chases you, that does not let you go. In Psalm 23, verse 6, it's that love that follows me all the days of my life. I want you to picture that life, that love of a parent that no matter how far you go, no matter what you do, the love that chases after. Do you picture that love now? I want you to understand the hesed. Psalm 136 has that Hebrew phrase at the end of every statement. Olam kesdo. That eternal love that forever chases you. Then comes next term, hen. It's first encountered in the story of Genesis. Noah has found hen in the eyes of God. You all know the story, right? Hen is a popular word in Hebrew, a lot of names. Hananiah, Hannah, Johan, John. That's the root, hen, which is grace, favor. Notice it's found where? In the eyes of God. In fact, when you do the study, 46 out of 66 mentionings in the Old Testament, hen is found in the eyes of someone, not only God. And I find that a beautiful picture. If I ever have a conflict with my wife, the only way I know I'm okay is when I look at her and say, honey, look at me. Do you ever experience that? If you're at odds with someone, they're avoiding the direct eye contact. They don't want to look you in the eye. You may not want to look them in the eye. In fact, the only way you know you're okay with someone is if they look you in the eye and you know in their eyes you are okay with them. Hen is the Hebrew concept of that close relationship of looking someone in the eye and saying, we are okay. We have that relationship. That is that hen, covenantal relationship of promise. Now I'm watching my clock here carefully. In Exodus 34, the names of God are given. Moses is asking God, God, tell me what is your name? And God says, I will reveal to you my name. I'm God who's gracious and merciful. And as I look at those names, I realize that the word for gracious is neither hesed nor hen, but yet another word is introduced, and it's Hebrew concept of raham. Now, if you've got any Muslim friends, you may know someone by name Rahim. That is a common name in Arabic, because the term raham means bosom. The first time it is used in Genesis is in chapter 49, verse 25, and it literally means the womb, the bosom. When a woman gives a birth to a baby, that baby is placed in her bosom, into her embrace. That term is relational embrace. Raham is God giving you a hug. I want you to start thinking this way. Hebrew language uses these three terms. One means I look at you with my eyes, and I tell you with my eyes that you're okay. I'm there for you. And I'm going to chase after you anywhere you go to hold you up, to support you. And above that, if you stop and you need my help, just turn around and I'll give you biggest hug I can. Hebrew uses these three terms to explain God's grace. It's not some tool invented by the Catholic Church. It's not some standard for us to reach by. It's a deeply relational concept. It's not only mother's embrace. You've heard the term of Abraham's bosom. That is the same thing. It's a father's embrace. It's that bosom of Abraham. That is the place where you hug when someone is hurting. And friends, I love it because it tells me that what I read simply as tender mercies or compassion or grace of God is much more than that. The reason these terms are interchangeable because they represent those parental feelings. These are relational concepts. God's grace for you is very much relational. In fact, the story in the New Testament of the prodigal son. And I love this concept of prodigal father. When I read first time, and we're speaking about learning the language, I was shocked. What do you mean prodigal father? Timothy Keller writes a book called Prodigal Father, and I struggle with that. Because see, in my language, the son is lost son. But prodigal doesn't mean lost. That means extravagant spender. Someone who gives everything and more, you see. And so when I look at this concept, I realize God is showing grace there. He sees his son, and he runs to embrace him. Do you see that? He sees his son, and he runs to embrace him. We don't have time to talk about it, but I raised 4 boys. One of them is right here, my big boy Danny. He's number 3. He's a pastor. I've seen my kids avoiding me as the father getting their business because they're doing something wrong. My youngest gave me most troubles. Since a little baby, he would do something wrong, and instead of hiding from us, he had the audacity to tell me and my wife, "Mommy, Daddy, close your eyes." That was his concept of putting us out of the picture. But you know what? We want to see them. We go to the end of the earth to help them. And when they're in trouble, what do? We hug them. And so I want you to understand grace in that deeply relational term. Because only recently I understand how much I miss grace, tangible, physical, in my life. 4 years ago, my father passed away. It was during the second wave of COVID. He had a weak heart, and he rests in Jesus. But as I look back, I tell you what I miss. I miss his eyes. He lived his last 15 years with me. We're a multi-generational family. And he was there. That's Grandpa. He was there with his watchful eye over his grandchildren. Wherever kids were doing something, Grandpa was there with his eyes, making sure that he sees what's happening in their lives. I miss his eyes because he was there to encourage and support me. When he came to live with us, we planted an orchard, and these were the first apples in our orchard in London. He would come when I would be doing something. If I'm struggling, he would come just to see what I'm doing. And that was support I needed. I remember once fixing a swatter in Saskatchewan in the field, and I was struggling taking the bearing off. And he saw me struggling there for over an hour, and he came over, said, "Son, just whack it." I said, "Dad, but I'm going to break the bearing." He says, "So what? We'll go and buy a new one. Why are you wasting your time?" And that's all I needed as a young person, that permission to whack it. Sometimes what kids and next generation needs from us is that eyes of affirmation that it's all right just to chop it and move on. My dad was there for me always, not only with his eyes. And I tell you, I resented him because when I grew up, he was the legalistic father. That's how I knew my dad. He was also a pastor. And the church I grew up with was so legalistic. I could tell you stories after story. He came once home late on Friday from reserves, because back in the Soviet Union until 55, everyone's supposed to go twice a year for retraining and so on. And because that was after sunset, he couldn't shower and couldn't shave, but he had to preach the next day. That was the church that I grew up in. But I saw how God was changing my father. I knew his eyes as always smiling. He was there pulling kids out of trouble. When kids got stuck in the muck in a van, he didn't yell at them, he didn't call them names, he didn't argue, he just helped to pull them out of trouble. And I tell you this, as I look at my father, I hope that I would give as much grace to my kids as my father gave to me. He was there to hug grandchildren when they were in trouble, when they were crying. Grandpa's embrace was the grace that they needed. And I hope that there's many grandfathers in a house. Sometimes the grandparents do with grandchildren what they miss to do with their own children. I've seen my dad show that grace to my kids that I missed. But before he passed, he would always tell me, son, I love you. He would look at me with those eyes full of favor and grace. And every time he could, he would give me the embrace that I needed just to encourage me. So friends, today I want you to reflect on this, that grace is not just a theological term. It's not some tool that priests or pastors use. It's even more than teaching that informs you how to live. Grace is first and foremost relational. It's giving that affirmation and support through a look of favor. It's giving the hug to a person who's struggling. And it's going extra mile to reach someone when they're alone. So as we move through this weekend, we'll hear a lot of seminars, there will be a lot of teaching. Remember God's grace in your life. Amen.